Tunisia in crisis as the president sacks the prime minister and suspends parliament. Kais Saied says he's trying to save the state. His critics say he's staging a coup. Plus, as the dust settles in South Africa, we ask what really led to the worst unrest since the end of apartheid. I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. Once hailed as the Arab Spring's greatest success, Tunisia today is facing arguably the biggest test of its democracy. Protests had erupted across the country, with demonstrators demanding the prime minister and Ennahda party resign over their handling of the pandemic and the economy. Now, riding the protesters' momentum, the president heeded their calls. On Sunday, Kais Saied sacked the PM and suspended parliament in what many are calling a coup. Parliamentary Speaker and head of Ennahda, Rashid Ghannouchi, tried to enter parliament to block the move, but he was stopped by the military. Now, before leaving, he had a message for the president.
Today, we were surprised by supreme decisions that not only surprised Ennahda, but also the Tunisian people and the world in a country that is proud of being the first Arab democracy, and having the latest constitution announcing decisions that are essentially a coup d'etat. This can be called nothing but a coup.
Well, Ghannouchi isn't the only one furious with the president. Former leader Monsef Marzouki says Tunisia has taken a huge leap backwards and returned to the days of dictatorship. Thousands have taken to the streets in support of Ennahda, but in this fragile democracy, divisions are still rife. So, just how did the country get to where it is today? In January 2011, millions rose up against the rule of Zine Al Abidine Ben Ali, forcing the strongman to relinquish power and flee the country. In October that same year, Tunisia held its first democratic election since independence in 1956. Ennahda won the most seats in parliament and formed a coalition with several secular parties to create a new constitution. But the process did not go smoothly. Successive government failures and infighting saw the economy crumble, leading to mass protests in 2013. Ennahda quit, but returned in 2014 to join a coalition with the country's first freely elected president, Bejicaid Essebsi. But after his death in 2019, Tunisians vented their frustrations at the ballot box, snubbing the country's major political parties to elect the independent political outsider, Kais Saied. And now he is accused of orchestrating a coup. Well, earlier, Rashid Ghannouchi told TRT World the people have rejected the actions of the president, but is Tunisia's democracy still at risk? Well, to discuss that now, I am joined from London by the editor-in-chief of the International Interest, Sami Hamdi. And Sharan Grewal is in Palermo, Italy. He is a non-resident fellow at the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. Thanks both so much for being with us. You know, Ghannouchi says the people have rejected the coup, but truth be told, there are supporters on both sides, seemingly now facing off in front of the parliament. Sharan, is this a dangerous manifestation of Tunisia's democratic political divide? You know, those who support Ennahda versus those who don't.
It is. First of all, it is a power grab on the part of the president, which has been met with some celebration from his supporters, but also much opposition from almost all of the major political parties. But what you're seeing now is dueling protests with supporters and opponents of the president both taking to the streets. And that is dangerous because it creates a tense situation that could easily lead to clashes between the two sides. And so it's important that there is a de-escalation and a move towards negotiations rather than the escalation we're seeing.
Right. Do you have any faith, Sharan, in this, 30-day freeze that this is said to be, while the president says he will choose a new prime minister that he can work better with, and it will all work out fine in 30 days' time when the parliament can reassemble and there could be peace and harmony in Tunisian government?
Not quite, because what the Article 80 stipulates is that in 30 days, the Constitutional Court would meet to decide that those conditions that created the exceptional situation have passed, and therefore that the exceptional powers should be removed. But there is no constitutional court in Tunisia that could decide that. It does not exist. And so it's difficult to trust the institutions to keep Kais Saied in check when those institutions don't exist, and what institutions there were, namely the parliament and the prime minister, have been dismissed in this power grab.
Okay. Sami, Sharan was saying that, yeah, it's a power grab. So you tell me, Sami, what do you think the president actually wants here? And what crisis was actually averted by taking the emergency measures that he's taken?
I think it's important to put it into context. The president ostensibly is claiming that the protests that are taking place on the streets, the protests in multiple provinces that in some instances have seen the offices of Ennahda burnt and stormed by angry protesters who blame Ennahda for the misery of the past 10 years and the failure to achieve the aspirations of the Arab Spring. Ostensibly, the president is saying, this is the crisis, this is the political crisis and economic crisis that I need to take charge of. But it's important to put this into the wider context in that as soon as Kais Saied came to the palace, as soon as he won the elections, the intent to rule directly was clear. The constitution prevents the president from exerting executive powers and makes parliament supreme. But Saied wanted to rule the country directly with this mandate that he won in the elections through a proxy prime minister. So he insisted on Ilyas al-Fakhfakh and raised the stick of early elections on the parliament in order to force them to toe the line. And the parliament, on the last day before there was going to be some sort of constitutional crisis as to whether there would be early elections, went along with the first prime minister and then brought him down later on corruption charges. When the president twisted the meaning of the constitution to appoint a new prime minister instead of allowing the parliament to do so, the parliament, or Ennahda in this case, convinced this prime minister to betray Kais Saied, to stop acting as his proxy, and subsequently remove the president's loyalists from government. So this tension has been there, and that Kais Saied wants to rule directly and has often asserted that the constitution needs to be changed, that it's not good for Tunisia, and that there needs to be a new system of governance. And by that, he means that he should be the one to rule. And he's found support for that in the political spectrum, in that despite the major parties today rejecting Article 80, including Tayar al-Demokrati and the leftists and the centrists, these leftist centrist parties were part of those who supported Kais Saied and called on him to implement Article 80. In some cases, Muhammad Abu, the former head of Tayar al-Demokrati, called for the army to come to the streets. This idea in that they pushed for Article 80 because they resented the fact that Ennahda continued to win the elections, albeit by less and less majority. This idea that if they can't win at the ballot box, then they'll win by means, i.e. using Kais Saied to implement Article 80. But it's important to look at what's happening in this context. This is a power struggle. Every Tunisian saw this coming. Kais Saied was threatening it. His supporters were threatening it. It's been going on for more than a year now. And this is the ultimate result of what has happened in this political stalemate between Kais Saied and Ennahda, in which Article 80 has been implemented at a time in which Kais Saied previously has said he will no longer sign any laws from parliament in objection to the removal of the interior minister, who was his ally and his proxy to control the security forces.
Okay. Sharan, Kais Saied has his supporters. We've seen them on the street. But tell us more about who really backs him politically. We have to remember he is an independent. He doesn't have a strong party behind him. So really, what is the political force that's allowing him to do this?
He does not have a party, and frankly, that is why he is popular. At this point, political parties are viewed as corrupt, as are viewed as self-serving and ineffective. And so what the president has is a cleaner personality that some Tunisians think, if he were to be empowered, would be able to solve their problems. At this point, Kais Saied, he had won in a landslide election in 2019 with 73% of the vote. Now he is down to perhaps a 40% approval rating, according to the most recent opinion polls. But what his moves are doing are giving him some popularity even beyond that 40% base. He has also appealed now to Tunisians who may not like the president as an individual, but are fed up with the political system, want a stronger presidency, want the political parties, and in particular Ennahda, to be thrown into prison, which as part of the president's decrees is going to lift parliamentary immunity so that parliamentarians could in theory be arrested and prosecuted. So Saied is therefore appealing to a much wider base than even people who like him as a person do.
You know, I'm going to throw this out there because I've spoken to some independent Tunisians who have said that what they fear what they're seeing now really does smack of Ben Ali's time. That it's this crackdown kind of on the opposition, crackdown on the media. We saw Al Jazeera's offices stormed. And that Tunisia, this is what one independent analyst told me, actually almost craves the day of a dictatorship in a sense, because they've had this freedom now for over a decade, and it hasn't worked out. So they see in Kais Saied someone who can bring the order that they feel has been lacking. Sami, do you see any truth to that, or is that far off?
I think it's important to stress in that the narrative on Tunisia outside of Tunisia has been very different from that inside Tunisia. The narrative outside Tunisia has always been this is wonderful success story, the Jasmine Revolution, the Arab Spring, and the fact that people can vote is the greatest thing on God's green earth. Whereas domestically in Tunisia, it's been more, okay, we voted in 2011, nothing changed. We voted in 2014, nothing changed. 2019, we're voting. Is this what democracy was all about? Is this what the Western world was always bragging about? In that I stay hungry and the politicians get fat off the resources of Tunisia. And it's important to put Tunisia into context in that the only reference point, the only benchmark they have to measure the success of democracy is 60 years of dictatorship. So a lot of the Tunisians are saying in those 60 years of dictatorship, there was stability, there was security. I'm not supporting dictatorship. Ben Ali and Bourguiba were tyrants, but I'm talking about the perspective that is prevalent, that drove the rise in the opinion polls of the former regime led by Abir Moussi in the Free Dastoor party. This notion that there was stability, there was security, there was certainty, and there was some sort of at least relative stability with which I could plan my day and I could at least plan my future, albeit without engaging in the political sphere. And it's this idea that this is the benchmark in which the democracy has failed. This idea that when people are complaining and saying, I have no water, I have no bread, water is cut off in provinces, I have to pay bribery, there's still corruption is rife, the parliament continues to bicker, there's all these ideas. Sipho focuses on the inheritance laws instead of on the economic development. There is this idea of this disconnect in that if this is the best that democracy brings, then let me go for somebody who can bring order. Amnu aman. It's something that the UAE, that Saudi Arabia, that Egypt, they've been propagating this rhetoric. Amnu aman, security and stability. And that's become a buzzword with regards to many Tunisians. And with regards to the youth, it's not necessarily that they long for the dictatorship. The longing for dictatorship is perhaps on the elder generation. But the younger generation are simply born into this revolution where all they've seen is disaster and crisis, and they believe that there has to be some change, which is why a lot of them supported Kais Saied. But where I would caveat, or just on a couple of sentences on this, where I would caveat is that, remember, I, as a Tunisian, I voted Kais Saied in the second round, but I did not vote Kais Saied because I supported him. I voted Kais Saied because the choice was between him and Nabil Al-Qaroui, who was accused of corruption, who was seen as part of this corrupt business community. I was put between a rock and a hard place, and I voted for Kais Saied. And this is why Kais Saied didn't move earlier, because he could not differentiate between those who voted for him because they supported him, or those like me who were caught between a rock and a hard place. And Saied is moving now because he has the input of the security forces, he has the input of Macron, he has the lobbying support of the UAE in Washington, he has the monetary support of Saudi Arabia, and he also has this popular anger which hates Ennahda so much that if the devil was to come from hellfire himself and say, I'll get rid of Ennahda, then many Tunisians will vote for the devil himself.
Okay.
That's the context that Kais Saied is moving in. And that's why your question is poignant, in that where does his support come from? It comes from a unified hatred of Ennahda, not a support for Kais Saied.
Very interesting. Sharan, I saw you nodding in agreement there. I mean, if so, if you are on the same page, what's the end game?
So let me emphasize 2 points. One, that while there is support for this power grab, on the other hand, there is also sizable opposition to it. Almost all of the political parties, the major political parties, have come out to oppose it. There is Ghannouchi and other supporters of Ennahda staging a sit-in outside of the parliament. There is very much dueling protests at this point, and that is a recipe for potential clashes and violence. And so it's important that, first of all, civil society step in and play a role. The labor union, the UGTT, needs to take the same more neutral role that it did in 2013 than it has somewhat since then, and as the most recent statement today reveals. Civil society needs to step in and broker dialogue as opposed to letting this escalate into violence. Because one thing that we have seen is that Kais Saied, to just emphasize a point made earlier, seems to have the support of the military and security forces. The army, which has historically been professional, apolitical, often neutral, in this case, secured the parliament and made sure that Ghannouchi could not enter the parliament, suggesting that it is following orders even when those orders are not necessarily constitutional, as the constitution mandates the parliament be in a continuous session, not frozen.
Okay.
And so it's a dangerous game here.
Okay, just final words, Sami, and if you can address, I mean, how much is the wider Arab world actually watching Tunisia right now to give some sense of hope for one revolution to somehow produce something more positive? I know you sound very cynical right now, but how important is this for the Arab world?
It's absolutely important. It's important to stress that this Arab Spring has been absolutely heartbreaking for every advocate of democracy in the region, not just because the UAE, Saudi, Egypt partnership managed to reverse much of the Arab Springs process, but also because Washington, Paris, Macron, who last year in 2020 in an interview with Le Grand Continent said that the Arabs chose regression in their democratic votes, implying that therefore there had to be some sort of change. This idea that the international community looked at the Arab Spring and sort of said, you all voted wrong, so we're not going to support it. We're going to recognize Sisi and let him speak at the Nelson Mandela Forum in the United Nations. We're going to call Mohammed bin Zayed the savviest of the Middle East leaders. That's Obama, not Donald Trump. We're going to deal with Mohammed bin Salman and give a Khashoggi report that doesn't bring anything into being. Tunisia is that last gasp hope, this idea that somehow the people can prevail over the international community and over the UAE, Saudi, Egypt access, with France included, in crushing that Arab Spring. And the reality is that it is a suffocating battle.
Okay.
It is a difficult battle, primarily because you're dealing with a population that is poor, that is desperate, that is going on boats of death trying to cross the Mediterranean, ripping up their passports, ripping up their ID cards, who are saying, listen, I'll trade places with you in London, just get me out of this hellhole that is Tunisia. All the while, every time they read foreign media, they read what a success story, democracy and the like. The reality is we need to start talking about Tunisia as it is in order to rescue the only gain left in the Arab Spring and prevent either a civil war or a return to an autocratic dictatorship in which everybody is expected to sing, clap, and absolutely be silent in terms of any opposition.
Okay, Sami, I will have to give you the final word. So unfortunately, we are out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank both my panelists sincerely very much for joining us. Now, not since the end of apartheid had South Africa seen the unrest it witnessed earlier this month. More than 330 people lost their lives. Thousands more lost their livelihoods after rioters looted and burned parts of KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng provinces to the ground. The spark that ignited that fire was the jailing of former President Jacob Zuma. The ex-ANC leader was sent to prison for contempt of court after failing to appear before investigators looking into corruption allegations. Now, for a number of South Africans, Zuma's imprisonment is just one of many serious grievances. Decades of corruption and vast inequality have led some to say they've had enough.
I'm looting because we apply for jobs, they don't give us jobs. We try and go to offices, try a strike, it doesn't even work. So the only resolution we came to is like the looting and stuff.
Now, to discuss what's transpired in South Africa, let's get to our guests. And joining me from the town of Mthunzini in Jacob Zuma's home province of KwaZulu-Natal is Professor Sipho Seepe. He is a political analyst and the Deputy Vice Chancellor at the University of Zululand. And from Johannesburg is political analyst and broadcaster Oliver Dickson. Thanks both so much for being with us. Oliver, let me start with you because the last time we spoke, you really downplayed the potential for South Africa to descend into violence. You seem to agree that Zuma supporters who challenged police at Nkandla were more of a fringe element that only existed in a certain part of KwaZulu-Natal. So did it shock you then to see the violence that ensued? I mean, the looter we just heard there made it sound like this was an expected, logical course of action.
Look, I don't think I downplayed it. Neither do I think that what I said is any different. Zuma supporters were, to a large extent, an isolated fringe group of supporters. It was not a lot of people. South Africa is a population of 60 million people. You can't convince me that a couple hundred people gathering outside of the former president's homestead translates into groundswell support. The violence that we saw broke out, I think, was sparked, at least as a catalyst, by Jacob Zuma's arrest, and at least instigators. What we now know through state intelligence briefings from the Ministry of the Military, as well as the Minister of Police, is that there were people, former state intelligence operatives, some of them perhaps might still be state intelligence operatives, 12 people to be precise, some of them who have been named, who apparently were behind instigating violence in certain pockets of KZN. Again, the violence, for the most part, was contained in KwaZulu-Natal, and not even across KwaZulu-Natal, specifically in predominantly the city centers of KwaZulu-Natal. That would be Durban, that would be Pietermaritzburg, and the other province was Gauteng. Again, I live near the city center in Johannesburg. I'm no more than 12 kilometers away from Johannesburg's CBD, and yet I witnessed and experienced absolutely no violence because, again, that was in isolated pockets. In Gauteng, it happened to be the case that it was predominantly in townships such as Soweto, where you saw this violence broke out.
Still, the violence we saw, the images were shocking, and I spoke to a number of South Africans that were genuinely shocked and really horrified by the state that they saw their country, and most did not expect that kind of dissent. But Sipho, let me get to you, because you described particularly the spark of these protests and riots as a lack of justice that many people were outraged with. But now we're hearing that it really represents this wider frustration with a system that has failed a huge number of South Africans post-apartheid.
Yeah, I think we must be honest about South Africa. South Africa has become a home of protest. The South African Institute of Race Relations records that since 2017, you have at most 10 protests per day. And these protests take place week in, week out. And then you have this unfolding issue where people see what they consider to be an anomaly in how the former president has been dealt with. And this is a matter that was also ventilated in the Constitutional Court. The reason why the Constitutional Court agreed to even to reconsider the idea of a recession is because it understands that it cannot ignore the minority judgment where their own colleagues are saying the majority has acted in a manner that is unlawful and unconstitutional. We must understand that our people here, we must not delegitimize their sense of grievance. These are the same people who, under apartheid, were the foot soldiers against a system that was unjust. So you can talk about the legal technicalities. What the people know is from a distance, they can tell when something is unjust. So even the Concord itself talked about what it called exceptional circumstances. And what the minority judgment was saying is that the reason why you have a law is that you must not be driven by a sense of anger. What came out of the minority judgment was a bristle of anger. And this is what people saw. And that almost gelled into their general sense of frustration that the post-1994 South Africa has not dealt with the historical injustices. So this is why as widespread as some people have seen. I've never seen anything like this since 1976. Right. And I was to my mother, who's not political, and she was also saying exactly the same thing, that this was the damage was so much. And that's why the government has had to find a way of saying, how do we deal with this? And it comes up with the notion of insurrection. But anybody who knows anything about a defense, that insurrection occurs when it is led largely by the military. We don't see the military being disgruntled and discontented.
Right. I do have to ask you something. We have such a short time, but I want to ask you, because you've said so much about the judiciary in this and how there was this unfairness in the judgment of Jacob Zuma and the broader implications of that. Do you worry now about long-term effects in degrading arguably the strongest institution in the country? I mean, the judiciary has always had the respect of South Africans, and its integrity has really never been questioned before now, and because of Jacob Zuma.
Yeah, I mean, it's been questioned even by its own members. So we must not try to underplay this. I mean, I'm sufficiently educated, and I can tell you that when there is a concept of a trial, and here people will tell you who are lawyers that there's a distinction between a trial and motion proceedings. And we had an unusual scenario where the Chief Justice writes to somebody and says, suppose if you're to be found guilty, what type of sentence would you want? It's unheard of. What you have is that the people are found guilty and then they try to mitigate against the sentence that they may be given. You don't have a person who has not gone through a trial. So when people see that, they say, this is a detention without trial. So we can play and try to spin it, but ultimately, justice must be seen also among the ordinary people. Okay. And the ordinary people are saying, we don't see justice in this case.
Okay. Oliver, I want you to comment on that, specifically about the effect on the judiciary. And I have to ask you as well, this is our final question, really. Even if what happened to Jacob Zuma isn't repeated, there is still the question of what happens to South Africans in the long term. This anger and this frustration, it seems to be building among a majority of the population that has no prospects for their future. There are no jobs. They continue to live in poverty with no hope and a growing lack of basic security in their daily lives.
Look, South Africa has a chronic unemployment problem. Our levels of unemployment is shocking. Specifically for young people, we're looking at 70% unemployment. That means 7 in every 10 young people in South Africa are without a job, without a source of income. And many of them have given up hope on ever finding a job. And oftentimes those who've given up hope are not even considered and counted by statisticians when they measure unemployment in the country. That's how grave and severe the problem is. And to be quite honest, this government has run out of ideas on how to create any sort of meaningful and gainful employment for the vast majority of unemployed young people in this country. And so the violence we saw, not as a consequence of Zuma's arrest, but as a consequence of inequality and poverty, will reappear and will replay multiple times over. It's not the first time we saw this. Every time that there are xenophobic attacks breaking out in various parts of South Africa, ironically, the xenophobic attacks happen in the places where we saw a lot of the violence play out over the last couple of weeks. When you see that xenophobic attacks happen and visited upon foreign nationals, you see the opportunistic crime taking place where people loot shops so that they can steal food, right? And I perhaps don't even want to use the word steal because it criminalizes poverty, which is something I don't think we should do as a political consciousness in a country that is as deeply impoverished as South Africa. And to that extent, I think we will see that play out again and again as we have starting 2008 towards the end of the Thabo Mbeki presidency, where xenophobic attacks became endemic in South Africa. Okay. But to answer your question on the judiciary, I think one, to simply say that there's dissent among lawyers is not to say that the courts are wrong. There's dissent amongst lawyers on virtually every case that exists, right? This is why there are two sides on every case. So I think Prof. Seepe is wrong to assume that dissent translates into a judiciary in trouble or translates to a judiciary that treated Jacob Zuma unfairly, because I think the majority judgment is quite clear. Right. You can't hold on to a minority judgment and simply say that's the right one simply because you think that makes sense with your political alignment. Unfortunately, that's not the case.
I'm going to have to interrupt it there, Oliver. I'm so sorry. And Sipho, I apologize as well. We're unfortunately out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank both of you so much for being with us and for our viewers as well. We'll see you next time.